So you're all here. It's a beautiful day outside. You're here listening to me instead. You could be doing other things. Why? You've either run into problems yourselves around managing requirements, or you need help with managing requirements and you're trying to get a little bit more education. There's a huge ripple effect that you can have with requirements. You can either do a really, really good job and your ripples are very small, your organization is not poorly affected, or you're not sure how to handle it. And this is what we're going to talk about, is managing requirements. You need a strong foundation, and managing requirements is part of that. So how do we do that? For some of you, you may be familiar with this. This is the law. Title 21, Part 820, Quality System Regulations. And what you see in this law is all this reference to requirements. It's throughout. CE mark also requires this. If you want to get, this isn't just FDA. If you want to get certification from outside agencies outside the US, there's other laws, and they too require emphasis on the requirements. And when you think about that, you need to be the expert of that law. It's not a very big book, so read it. Understand what you're dealing with. It's very important. We want to take a systems approach. We want to take the big picture. How are you going to manage your requirements? If you focus on the smallest, if you focus on the electronics and that resistor, you're not going to have a hard time dealing with where you're going. But you don't want to do that. You want to focus on the big picture. You want to focus on how are you going to organize the organization, how you're going to organize your documents, how you're going to organize your development. That's where you're going. And know what the story is. Really try and understand what it is that you're trying to tell your organization, as well as the governing bodies that you're going to present your material to. And if you have that end in mind, what the package is going to look like when you submit it. These are all very, very important. And you have a lot of stakeholders when you take a systems approach. You have your organization, you have marketing, you have user needs, you have engineers. There are a lot of different stakeholders, and there are a lot of people, and they all have good ideas, but you have to focus on the correct ideas. So take a big picture approach, bring it down, and focus there. Implementation independent. When you're starting off with the project, you really actually want to start at your market needs. My pointer doesn't work, so I apologize. Otherwise, I'd be pointing over there. It actually works on the back wall, but it doesn't work on the screen. User needs, market needs. What is driving your system requirements? You've got all of these different factors coming into play. You've got your hazards analysis, your risks. They are all part of the question of what is in your system requirements. You've got your formative, your human factors that you're trying to understand what your users need. And you're bringing all this together into your system requirements. But these are implementation independent. They shouldn't be about detail. And you're not trying to say how things are done. You're focusing on what needs to get done. As you move to the right, and this doesn't really portray a timeline, although the arrow's moving that way, from your system requirements, you're developing your architecture. What does your big picture block diagram look like? What are the components? What's your software? What's your electrical? What's your mechanical? What's your user interface? All of that needs to come together into your architecture document. And then you're working from there into breaking that down into more and more detail. You're constraining your system into your subsystem requirements. And when you're getting to this point, your detail is getting more and more refined, and your constraints are getting more and more clarity. And that's where you're headed. One of the things that this diagram doesn't portray, which we'll talk about later, is you're going to come back. You're going to go back to those user needs, because guess what? When you start working on that architecture, you got to figure out, I missed something. And you're going to go back to those user needs and your risk management. And you're going to come back to your system requirements and add requirements. That's great. In the words of David Bowie, I was singing to my coworker, changes. Changes are going to happen. Remember that song? Changes, face those requirements. It works, okay? You got to come back. And again, you focus on your architecture, do that big picture, and then you get into your subsystem. You've got your electrical, your mechanical, your software, you've got other subsystems, and you may have architectures within those, especially software. And then you get your design. Risk management. At the core of this is risk. Your requirements in medical devices, you need to focus on risk. It's very, very, very important. But the blocks and the organization revolves around these standards that you have. IEC 60601. If you look at 60601, within there you might have various standards that you have to comply with. Drop tests, interference with electrical, susceptibility. You have software that you have to deal with, alarms in 60601-8. Those are all intended to reduce your risk. Risk to the patient, risk to the user. So you have two ways to handle 60601. You can say, I shall comply with all of 60601. That might be what you want to do, but you have another way to do it, which is, we shall comply with section XYZ of 60601. When you move into IEC 62304, that guidance is to govern you in how you're going to develop your software. And that's great. And within there, one of the lines is you have to develop your risk assessment, and you do your FMEAs. 62304 is bigger than that. We could talk for 30 minutes, probably longer, on just 62304. Moving on to 62366. What's your usability? That's a very big question for you. How are you going to design this user interface? How are you going to test it? Are you doing a formative and a summative? How are you going to do that? A lot of planning that goes into place. And binding all of these processes together is the general QMS of 13485. So risk is at the center of it, and then you have all of these other standards that you have to comply with. This is a complex document tree. And what we have at the top is user needs or market requirements. And then we go into system requirements. If you look, again, like I talked about in the previous slides, you go from your most open requirements or least detailed down into your subsystems where you have more and more requirements. Why is this structure so important? This is very critical to your organization to not only know who, but also what. How many documents do you have? This is a complex document tree or document structure. If you have a much smaller device that you're building, you don't need all these documents. You can put all your software requirements at the system level. That works just fine. You can have one FMEA with subsections for your electrical, for your mechanical, for your software. That's quite okay instead of breaking it out into all of these different FMEAs. But this is a map. If you have a complex, let's say you have a heart defibrillator, you're probably going to be this big. Okay, it's going to be much more complex. If it's an infusion device, it's probably this big. If it's a peritoneal device, it's this big. If it's a small little desktop unit for doing measurements, it's probably not this big. So think about what your structure is going to look like. And this also, oddly, is who's working on this document. So there's a lot of planning that goes in here. Balance. This is hard. It really is hard. When you think about the balance of your requirements, I worked on a device, we had over 6,000 requirements to start, and there were conflicts within it. We had to whittle that down because nobody knew how to test. They weren't sure what they were testing. So we were way over here in process overload. We were writing test cases to requirements that didn't exist anymore. But they didn't know it because they were focused on, well, what does this do? And we had to whittle those requirements down. I actually took a very tactical approach and I organized a group and we called it the Specathon. And we put together 10 tables with each discipline for every spec. And we spent 4 hours a day for 2 weeks getting those requirements right. Was this expensive? Yes. But I couldn't afford this. So I had to come back to a balance. And with focusing on balance and having the right amount of requirements and the correct requirements, your time to market will be faster. If you have 2 people working on a project, put them both in a room, they can communicate very effectively. You have 60, 100 people working on a project, how are you going to get that information to them? How are you going to build, if you want to talk about a large system? How are you going to get, if you have an IT-based system, with a device, with the cloud, with other monitors in place? You need to focus on your time to market. So balance. Really think about that when you're organizing your requirements. So what's a good requirement? So for all of you marketing people out there, take no offense. This isn't meant to jab you with any negative connotations. What the real purpose of this is to say that you really need good requirements. It's an art as well as it is a science. Write good requirements. They do need to be unique. They can't have compound sentences within them because then become very difficult to test. They can't be ambiguous because if somebody reads them and say, well, I'm not sure what this is, you're not going to get what you want. We thought about putting up the poster of the swing set with the tree in the middle and the rope on the sides, but everyone's seen that. But thought this was a better graphic. Verifiable. Can you test this? That's the question. You know, if your QA organization or your engineers can't test it, you're in trouble and you have to go back later to write the right requirements. And I said it in the previous slide, but focus on what, not how. What does this device do, not how. We don't need the marketing department or even the system engineers telling us how to do things. Put that in the design spec. Your requirements are for what the device does. Focus on what. So if you look at the far left, your user needs or your marketing requirements, this is how your tree actually pans out as you get more and more detail and you put more and more constraints on these requirements. Market needs. Device shall alert the user when the battery's low. Okay, all of your cell phones do that. Some way they either flash, some of their early versions of your cell phones turned off. Your medical devices can't just do that. They've got to flash 20%, 15%. You've got to have some type of indicator. But your marketing needs are just flash when it's low. That's your least constrained requirement. And what's your system requirements? Well, it's going to display a visible or audible indicator for low battery. Okay, now we're getting more and more specific. Can my QA organization test to that requirement? Yep, they can. They can write a test case to that. And that then drives your architecture description. Okay, I have a 1024 by 1024 LCD. This is great. Now my electrical engineers, my software engineers have a better idea of what they're building. And then I get into my subsystems. The control board shall drive the LCD. Okay, how is that going to be done on the electrical side? And the software subsystem shall display battery low when the register drops below this value. Okay, that works. I can test these requirements, and if you notice, I have test cases that line up at the far right around my electrical and my software. Why have I gone to this trouble? Tracing is very important. It's required both by the CE mark and it's required by FDA. But it's also necessary for your organization. Your engineers won't be around forever. And when they come back, or you hire somebody else and they go, well, what does this mean? You have the ability to look back through the entire document tree and see where my tracing is. Where did this requirement come from? Well, it started with my system requirement. That started from with marketing need. There's another piece that's important here. If you run a test case and it fails, test case could have failed, the software could have failed, the electronics could have failed, or the requirement failed, okay? Using tracing, you can look back throughout the requirements and decide where the change needs to occur. And with tracing, you have one other piece of it. You can go back to those other requirements. If the top level requirements needs to change, you know everything that's affected. So it gives you a really, really objective roadmap. Now this is hard. Your engineers will struggle with this at times because sometimes they're going to want to trace to everything. And you got to restrict that, because when you do a trace matrix, which you have to send to the FDA, and it's wrong or it has too many traces in it, you run into a big problem because now there's no meaning. It means retest everything. And one of your objectives here when you have to do regression testing is to limit your testing, be able to do targeted testing. This is another diagram. It's very similar, but this is a modification of the FDA's diagram. You have your market needs. And in the FDA parlance, everything is either design input or design output, essentially. And you can look at this I want to translate this and map it. I have my design output, which could be my system requirements, and then I have my architecture. And my architecture then drives my subsystem requirements, and that became a design output. And I was able to create my medical device. You can also look at this. If you had a complex system, you could drive my design input, could be my software subsystem, that then drives into my architecture, which then drives into my output, which was my subsystem software, if I have a complex software system, and again, am able to build my medical device. What is verification? Verification is objective evidence that you've met your requirements. It is testing to ensure that you have met and verified that requirement. So my arrows go back to the left again. And so again, changes occur throughout this project. You're going to have to verify, and again, you might have had a mistake. Well, what do? You come back. Do you have to change your design input? Do you have to change your test? Do you have to change the software? Validation is making sure that you've met your user needs. And so you're validating according to your user needs, which are your marketing requirements, and you may need to change those. There will be times when you release a product and you find out that you haven't met your user needs. What do? Don't be afraid of that. That's okay. Change happens. If you have to add a display, re-release your software, it's going to happen. You hope it doesn't, but it might. Well, what does tracing do? And that's what this diagram shows again. Reviews. The other piece I want to talk about in this diagram is your review. And throughout this process, the FDA expects that you have objective evidence that you've reviewed your requirements and you've reviewed your process along the way. Tracing and requirements management tools. Why do I use tools? I can use Excel, I could use a piece of paper. The FDA doesn't say how you're going to trace this, and I talked about tracing before. But these management tools are actually very helpful. They're complex at times to install, and I've essentially put this in order of complexity and cost. Excel, it's all the different boxes you have in Excel. You can put your system requirements in one column, then put your subsystem requirements in the next, and then your test cases. You can do that. But if you have 4,000 requirements, it's hard. It's very hard. So think about a management tool and how you're going to organize that. We've used cPine, I've used Excel, I've used Doors, I've used Rec Pro. There are others out there. These are very, very, very important tools. They help you because in the end, you get to print off your trace matrix, send that in with your submission. When you have to get a trace diagram of I changed the software, because one of the things we do is we actually trace to software modules. So I am able to do a back trace and say, okay, what modules changed? Oh, I changed foo.c, bar.c, h.h files. Come back, see how that affected. In summary, I want you to take a systems approach. Think big picture. Don't think little, think big. How are you going to do your diagram? How are you going to design your system and your organization to make sure that you get your needs met and get the requirements done correctly? Balance. I talked about balance. I worked on 6,000 requirements. That's a lot of requirements. We didn't need that many. We whittled them down to 4,000. 3,500 was what it was about. You really do want to balance what you need with what your organization needs. And think about it. And think about who you have in your organization. Make sure that balance is correct. A plan. You need a document plan. How are you going to organize your documents? How are you going to organize the structure of your organization? Who's working on which document? These are very, very important conversations that you have to have up front. The foundation, having a strong foundation is critical. If everyone thinks about a house, there are two things you want to keep right: your foundation and your roof. Okay? So without your foundation, your house is going to crumble. Without your roof, water's going to get in and leak. So think about your roof, more about your organization, your tools, how you're going to protect this document structure. And understand the context of each requirement. What's a good requirement? Does it say how? Does it say I need a 30 ohm resistor in this part? No, I hope not. I hope that's in your design document. I want you to say, what does it do? It shall display battery low. Okay, that's what it does. It doesn't say how. There's no detail in that. So understand the context of it and write really good requirements. Any questions? Dave.
I noticed that you have unique and singular both on there. They sound the same. Can you differentiate those two properties?
They are very subtle, the difference between them. When I say singular, I really mean that you want to have one statement within there. I don't want compound statements. Unique is a little bit different. I don't want multiple ideas within there, within the concept. So I don't want to say, shall display battery low and the LED shall be red, okay? When the battery is below 20%, put up battery low. The software shall display an LED, a red LED, when the battery is lower than 10%. Those are two different ones. They are singular. They are also unique because each one is focused on the LED, and they're testable. I can now have my software engineer focus on that one. Okay, so they're similar, but there is a slight difference. I don't want to say it shall do both, because now my QA people will have a harder time.
I see your slide mentioned about 6,000 and then...
yes.
Yeah. So you say we'll reduce to 4,000.
Yes.
And then you think how many percentage is good for that? Is in case 6,000 go to 4,000, how you screen to go to 4,000 and then you go to reduce to 2,000, or you think it's 4,000 is the right number for that?
It wasn't the number so much as we had a focused effort. What had happened during that particular product is there were so many designs put forward, there were prototypes put in place, and some of it was the organization. We weren't focused on the design structure to start. One of the other things I had done during that project was put together the document map. So there were 7 microprocessors in it. Yeah. So each one had a software section, but each one also had an electrical section, and then there was a mechanical section. And some of the components that they had put into the product originally were taken out. But because they weren't focused on the requirements to start, because they were really prototyping and writing requirements almost simultaneously, they weren't thinking in unison. And so by focusing on the requirements, they actually started focusing appropriately on what the needs of the product were. And so some of it was an iteration through and spiral iteration of going back and saying, well, we're at a point now we know exactly what we're building. And so we were able to whittle down, and we were able to write better requirements. There were some requirements in there that are also design statements. They said exactly how the product was supposed to work. By removing those statements and putting them into the design document, and that's one of the things that we were able to do during this meeting, we picked up whole sections of documents and put them in another document.
Thank you.
To delete them.
You have not, I didn't see when is the right time for the requirements to be reviewed by the QA and by the software.
So I didn't speak a lot about review, and you're right. So did everyone hear the question? Yeah? So she's asking about when do you get the review process done? I like to review early. I'd like to have peers do a lot of review. Right now in a project that we're working on, we actually have software engineers sitting right next to each other. So they're dynamically reviewing all of the requirements, and they have a checklist, they type right down what requirements they're working on, and they're dynamically reviewing their design documents to the point where one person is writing, and because they're in the same room, they actually say, hey Joe, I'm going to put a TBD, your name, and the details I need from you here. So that's one way to do the review, peer review. But we also have formal reviews. So when the document is done, we actually, if the question is it hard copy controlled or soft copy controlled, and I'm not sure what your organization is. If it's soft copy controlled, we can have a formal review with a lot of these tools that we use. CPine does it, Doors does it, in which you can have electronic signatures and release your product that way and move it through a formal review process. If it's hard copy, we're going to take that document and either sit in a room, and people will have read it before. I don't like people coming to a meeting and reading the document at the meeting. It doesn't do anybody any good. It's a waste of their time. So its real question is, have you read the document yet, yes or no? And if the answer is no, then we ask them to reschedule the meeting. Does that answer your question? Okay.
So you talked about having the system view of requirements, and who typically writes the system requirements?
We have, oh yeah, I have a mic. We typically have a system engineer writing the system level requirements, or in the software realm, if we have a lead software engineer writing those requirements. It's very important to think about who should be in that role of systems engineer. It's usually not a software engineer, it's usually an electrical or a mechanical engineer, because they have a different approach to developing a medical device. They think about the system. And there are software engineers who are talented enough to take that role, but typically electrical engineer thinking about how is this device going to fit together. That's a very good question. Do people have system engineers within their organization? Quite a few. So, and what's their background? Okay.
In a follow-up question, do you see that there's differences in the way you would write requirements for software or hardware?
Yes. Hardware requirements are focused much more on performance often. There are performance level requirements in the software realm, but they're usually at the lower level. You have to think about how the software has to perform within the system when you focus on those. And they're usually, how fast does the read have to be on this sensor? How many times is it read? How are you going to deal with the system level? How are you going to aggregate the data? Is it simply an average, or do you have to do some other type of algorithm on it, some type of filter? So that's the software side of it. And usually electrical engineers will help with that. From an electrical standpoint, there's so many more performance level requirements that you have to make sure that you meet. And so yes, there is a difference, and it's a different way of thinking. Software also has to focus now much more on user interface and safety. And that's, go back to risk. Everything is about risk. Understand your risk. I can't say it enough. Are there any other questions? Come visit us at our booth, 535. If you have any other specific questions, want to talk to me or anyone else within our organization, we'll be there this afternoon. Thank you.